In this video on the Japanese binding known as Fukuro-toji or pouch binding, I'm going to show you how to sew the outer binding in the 4-hole variant like this one. For starters, we need to choose front and back if you haven't done so already. Keep in mind that the Japanese language is read the opposite direction from English. I tend to make the back of my book whichever side that has the knots from the inner binding. That way if there's any slight bulge that shows through the back cover, it will be on the back side where people will be less likely to see it. So I'm going to make this my back. And I'm going to mark it to make it a little easier to tell in subsequent steps. So the first thing we'll need to do is mark where we're going to place or punch our holes to sew our binding. I generally, for this size book, do about 3/8 of an inch in from the edge, the spine edge, where we did our inner binding, and then 5/8 of an inch in from top and bottom. The other two holes are placed such that there is equal spacing for the 3 long stitches. Unfortunately, for this specific size of paper that I started with, a half sheet of letter size printer paper, this doesn't divide evenly into 3 in a useful measurement. So I tend to do either 1 3/8 inches and 1.5 inch, or 1 7/16 inch and 1 3/8 inch, depending. So normally I would use my bone creaser to make a nice crease mark at the 3/8 inch line. However, to make it easier to see on the video, I'll use my handy dandy pencil. So I'm going to measure 3/8 inch in, and draw a line. The reason I usually do this with a creaser is because this line could show up. In theory, it will be completely covered by the embroidery floss we're going to use to sew the outer binding, but why take that chance? But it does make it much easier to see if you use a pencil. So next, I'm going to measure the 5/8 inch on top and bottom. And then because my ruler doesn't measure 16ths, I'm going to do 1 3/8 inch, and then 1.5 will be the space. So 1 3/8 inch. And assuming I measured and calculated everything correctly, this should be 1.5, which it's close. It's not critical that you get everything exact in your placement. It's just traditional to have equal stitch lengths. Note that that is for the Japanese version. There's a Chinese and a Korean version of this style binding. I know for the Chinese they tend to group the center 2 holes closer together. I don't know about the Korean version. I haven't looked into that one yet. So once we've marked our holes, we need to punch them. As before, I'm going to use my awl and my rubber mallet. If you don't have an awl, you can use a thin nail such as you would use to hang pictures, or a very sturdy needle. If nothing else, you could use a small drill bit. Just be sure to clamp everything down very, very well so it doesn't shift while you're trying to drill holes. I haven't tried that method, but in theory it would work. And then I have my stack of junk mail that I use to protect my work surface from my awl. So as with the inner binding, you want to make sure that your awl is perpendicular to the page, not at some funny angle. And you want to be gentle, as gentle as you can with the rubber mallet when you're pounding it through. The point is to get the awl all the way through the stack of paper, not to break your awl. I'm going to pause for a minute while I hammer the holes because it's very loud. As you can see, I've driven the awl fairly far through the paper. My awl is a tapered awl, so the farther I drive it in, the wider the hole it makes. I know that I need to pass my needle and thread through each hole 3 times, so I want to make sure that all the holes are big enough to allow that. And then I'm going to stick my awl back through the hole because, as I mentioned, it's tapered. And I want to make sure that each hole is wide enough all the way through. So now we have our holes punched, all 4 of them. It's time to sew them up. So you're going to need a needle with an eye big enough to hold your embroidery thread, and then embroidery thread in a color that suits you and the cover. I tend to do complementary contrasting colors, but that's me. And your thread needs to be approximately 3.5 to 4 times the height of the book. For beginners, I suggest you go a little bit over, though not too much. You don't want to have to tie in thread partway through, but you also don't want thread so long that it becomes a snarled mess very easily. So you're going to thread your needle, and then you're going to tie just a simple knot in the other side. You can, if you want, skip the step of tying the knot and just put a little bit of glue on the end before we feed it through. But I prefer not to rely on the glue to hold it in place while I'm working and tugging on it. You want to make sure that your knot is slightly bigger than the holes so it doesn't pull through them. It doesn't need to be significantly bigger, just a little. So I'm going to start from the back, from the second hole over. So this is going to be hole number 1, hole number 2, hole number 3, hole number 4. So I'm going to go into the spine just a little bit, and I'm going to go up through hole number 2. And I find it's easier to do this to the pages and then to the cover rather than trying to do it all in one go. You may find it easier to do with a curved needle and then switch to a straight one. I did not have any more luck doing this easily with a curved needle than I did with a straight one, so I just use a straight one. One thing I'll note before we get going, if you remember in the last video when we were folding over the covers, we wanted to make sure that the distance here wouldn't cause us to go through both layers, and it has not. I probably could have folded this a little skinnier than I did, but it will work. And that's just because you don't want to make your life any harder than it has to be going through extra bulk from the paper. Alright, so the first step, so we've come out onto the back in hole number 2. We're going to loop around from the front through hole number 2. So we're going to form this loop. Try not to go through the individual threads of your embroidery floss if you can help it. I'm using basic cotton embroidery floss because it works well for practicing and it's widely available. A more appropriate material that was used in the medieval period is silk. Silk is expensive. I do not recommend using silk until you have gotten good at the techniques involved. Alright, so we now have a loop around hole number 2, around the spine. So we're going to go to hole number 3. We're going to go down from the back to the front through hole number 3, making a long stitch. And then we're going to loop the thread over, and we're going to go back through hole number 3 from the back to the front again, making a loop around the spine. And I'm adjusting my loops to be as close to perpendicular to the spine as I can. And then we're going to take our thread, and we're going to do a long stitch to hole number 4 from the front to the back, except I dropped my needle. Long stitch. And then we're going to loop through the same hole from the front to the back again, around the spine. And then we're going to loop from the front to the back again. This time we're going over this edge. Like that. And again, we want it roughly perpendicular to that edge. And then we're going to go back down through hole number 3 from the back to the front, forming that long stitch. Like that. And then we're going to go through hole number 2 from the front to the back. So now you have 3 loops over the spine, 1 loop over either the top or bottom, I guess, depending on which way you decide to hold your book, top or bottom edge, 3 long stitches back and front. So now we're going to go to hole number 1. Since our thread is on the back, we're going to start from the back to the front to make a long stitch. Then we're going to loop over the spine, go from the back to the front again, make our loop over the spine, and then we're going to loop over this other edge, so to the back to the front again, forming that loop. So now the back's done. We've just got 1 stitch left on the front. So, through hole number 2, from the front to the back. Alright, now we've got all our stitches. We just need to tie off the thread. So you're going to take your needle, you're going to feed it underneath on a diagonal beneath these 2 threads. And you're going to form a loop, and then you're going to take your needle back through the loop. And you're going to pull it tight. And it's going to make a little knot around the juncture. And then if you want to be extra secure, you do it again. So now you have a little, barely indistinguishable knot right there. Now we need to hide the loose end of our thread. So we're going to go back into hole number 2, but not straight through to the other side. We're going to go on a diagonal out through the spine. And I will be perfectly honest with you, this is probably the hardest stitch. So going back out through the spine somewhere. It might be the same place that you buried the knot before, it might be somewhere different. And this is where having a thimble or something may be useful to help you push the needle out. Pliers can be helpful to help you drag the needle through, or a piece of leather to grab it better. Or you can just wiggle it a bunch and eventually it comes out. So now we're going to take our scissors, just kind of press the needle there. And we're going to snip the loose end of our thread flush with the spine, and I tend to do it at an angle over here away from where we did the stitch. And we're going to de-thread our needle. We're going to take a little bit of glue, just a little bit. I probably grabbed too much, quite honestly. And we're going to sort of apply it to the loose end of our thread as we gently shove it back inside the spine. We're just going to kind of squeeze gently so that the loose end is hidden inside the spine where nobody will see it and it's less likely to come unraveled. And then we're going to clean off the excess glue from our needle because we want to be able to use our needle again in the future. And you can take your binder's clips off, and I'm going to take my back tag off because your book is now sewn together. One thing we still have to do though is finish attaching the covers to the end pages. So not quite there yet. So we're going to take a small amount of glue. As a reminder, I use rice starch glue for this, but you can use PVA, either the fancy bookbinder stuff or basic Elmer's glue if that's what you have. And I use my fingers because starch glues tend to form a paste more so than other glues, and it's difficult to do with a brush. Much easier to just use my fingers. So I'm going to apply glue to the front cover where it's been folded over on the foredge. And then I'm just going to gently press down, gluing my end page to my front cover, or back cover, whichever this one was. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. You can, if you really want, apply glue to more than just this flap, but this is really all that's necessary to hold it. Since the cover is most firmly attached by the stitching that we did, and the glue is just to keep the end page in place and to make it look prettier. And now your book is done. At this point, I will generally put a piece of parchment paper in between my first page and my last page, just in case any glue happens to seep around the edges. I don't want to accidentally glue the book cover to more than just the end page. And then I will put it in a press until the glue dries, or overnight in many cases, even though glue tends to dry faster where I'm at. And that's the basic 4-hole stitch variation of doing the outer binding. There are other variations that were also historical. I will cover those in future videos.